and the seeds of discord, a wartime impasse. The clock in General Eisenhower's command trailer reads 11:30 on the evening of August 30th, 1944. Outside, the summer air carries the distant rumble of supply convoys moving through the French countryside, their headlights cutting through the darkness like fallen stars. Inside, beneath the amber glow of a single desk lamp, the Supreme Allied Commander sits hunched over a collection of maps, intelligence reports, and urgent cables from London and Washington. The liberation of Paris 5 days earlier should have been a moment of pure triumph. Yet tonight, Eisenhower finds himself wrestling with what may prove to be the most consequential strategic decision of the entire European campaign. The papers scattered across his desk tell a story of unprecedented success. In just 11 weeks since D-Day, Allied forces have shattered the Atlantic Wall, broken out of Normandy, and sent German armies reeling across France in what can only be described as a rout. The Wehrmacht's 7th Army has been virtually annihilated in the Falaise pocket. The German 15th Army is in full retreat toward the Low Countries, and perhaps most symbolically powerful of all, the City of Light now flies the tricolour once again, its citizens dancing in streets that just days before had echoed with the jackboots of the occupier. Yet for all these victories, Eisenhower knows that the war is far from over. Intelligence estimates suggest that despite their catastrophic losses in France, the Germans are already beginning to reconstitute their defences along the Reich's western frontier. The Siegfried Line, that formidable belt of fortifications running from the Swiss border to the North Sea, awaits. Winter approaches, and with each passing day, the window for ending this conflict in 1944 grows narrower. It is against this backdrop of triumph tinged with urgency that two of Britain's most celebrated military minds have presented Eisenhower with fundamentally incompatible visions for the final push into Germany. The disagreement centers not merely on tactics or timing, but on the very nature of how modern warfare should be conducted, and it threatens to tear apart the carefully maintained unity of the Anglo-American alliance at the moment when that unity is needed most. The first vision belongs to Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein and commander of the British 21st Army Group. Monty, as he is universally known, has never been one to doubt his own judgment or to express it with anything less than complete conviction. Standing barely 5 feet 7 inches tall, with his sharp features and penetrating blue eyes, Montgomery possesses an intensity that can fill a room. His tactical brilliance is unquestioned, his ability to work harmoniously with others rather less certain. Montgomery's proposal is audacious in its simplicity and breathtaking in its scope. He envisions a single concentrated thrust northward through the Netherlands and into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. 40 divisions, he argues, properly supplied and supported, could punch through German defences like a spear point, crossing the Rhine and positioning themselves to capture the factories and coal mines that fuel the Nazi war machine. Give him priority for fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, Montgomery insists, and he can end the war by Christmas. The plan bears all the hallmarks of Montgomery's military philosophy. Throughout his career, from the Western Desert to Sicily to Normandy, Monty has favored what he calls tidy operations, carefully planned, methodically executed, with overwhelming force concentrated at the decisive point. He abhors improvisation, despises what he sees as American tendencies toward untidy advances on multiple axes. Better, in his view, to strike once with devastating effect than to dissipate strength across a broad front. There is undeniable logic to Montgomery's argument. Military theorists from Clausewitz to Liddell Hart have emphasized the principle of concentration of force. The German army, despite its recent defeats, remains a formidable opponent when given time to dig in and organize defensive positions. A swift, focused advance might indeed catch them off balance, might exploit the current chaos before new defensive lines can be established. Yet Eisenhower finds himself deeply troubled by Montgomery's proposal, and not merely because of the Field Marshal's characteristic assumption that he and he alone should lead such an offensive. The Supreme Allied Commander's concerns run deeper, touching on fundamental questions of strategy, logistics, and alliance politics that Montgomery seems either unwilling or unable to fully grasp. From a purely military standpoint, Eisenhower questions whether the current logistical situation can support the kind of concentrated advance Montgomery envisions. The Allied supply line now stretches over 400 miles from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. The great port of Antwerp remains in German hands, forcing every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every replacement soldier to make that grueling journey by truck convoy across war-torn France. American logistics officers estimate that maintaining 40 divisions in sustained offensive operations would require nearly 20,000 tons of supplies per day, a staggering burden for an already overstretched transportation network. Moreover, Eisenhower's strategic vision differs fundamentally from Montgomery's in ways that reflect not just military doctrine, but national character and political necessity. Where Montgomery sees the war as a problem to be solved through the application of superior British tactical expertise, Eisenhower must balance military considerations against the complex realities of coalition warfare. American public opinion, American political leadership, and American military commanders all expect U.S. forces to play a leading role in the final victory. The idea of relegating the First and Third Armies to secondary defensive roles while Montgomery's forces claim the glory of crossing the Rhine is politically unthinkable. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group and Eisenhower's most trusted subordinate, has made his feelings on the matter abundantly clear. Bradley, whose calm demeanor and unpretentious manner have earned him the nickname the Soldier's General, represents everything that is methodical and pragmatic about American military leadership. He favors what he calls a broad front approach, simultaneous advances along multiple axes, keeping constant pressure on German defenders while maintaining flexibility to exploit whatever opportunities develop. Bradley's arguments carry considerable weight with Eisenhower, not least because they align with American military doctrine and American political requirements. Rather than gambling everything on a single thrust, Bradley proposes advancing on a front stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Such an approach would prevent the Germans from concentrating their reserves against any single point of attack. It would ensure that American forces remain actively engaged, rather than relegated to supporting roles. And it would reduce the risk of catastrophic failure that might result if Montgomery's narrow thrust were to encounter unexpected resistance. The debate between these competing visions has been simmering for weeks, conducted in conference rooms and private meetings across liberated France. But tonight, as Eisenhower reviews the latest intelligence reports and supply estimates, the disagreement has reached a critical juncture. Montgomery has formally requested a meeting to present his case one final time. Bradley has made it clear that he considers the British plan not merely strategically unsound, but personally insulting to American forces and their commanders. And from Washington, General George Marshall has cabled his expectation that American armies will play a prominent role in the final offensive, regardless of whatever arrangements might seem militarily optimal. The weight of decision presses heavily on Eisenhower's shoulders as he studies the maps spread before him. Here, marked in blue, are the current positions of Allied forces. Montgomery's army group north of the Ardennes, Bradley's forces to the south, each poised for what might be the final push of the European war. Here, marked in red, are the estimated German positions, weakened certainly, but not yet broken, falling back toward defensive lines that grow stronger with each passing day. The irony is not lost on the supreme Allied commander that this moment of strategic discord comes at the very apex of Allied success. Just 5 days ago, he stood with General de Gaulle on the Champs-Élysées, watching Free French forces parade past crowds of delirious Parisians. The newsreels captured that moment for history. The liberation of one of Europe's greatest cities, the symbolic heart of Western civilization restored to freedom after 4 years of occupation. Yet even as those celebrations continued, Eisenhower knew that the most difficult decisions still lay ahead. Victory in Normandy had been achieved through careful planning, overwhelming material superiority, and the kind of meticulous inter-allied cooperation that had become the hallmark of his command. Now, with the end of the war tantalizingly close, that spirit of cooperation faces its greatest test. The fundamental question before him is not simply whether to support Montgomery's concentrated thrust or Bradley's broad front advance. It is whether the Anglo-American alliance can maintain its unity of purpose and command when national interests and military philosophies pull in different directions. It is whether the careful balance between British experience and American resources that has carried the Allies from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of the Reich, can survive the pressures of approaching victory. As midnight approaches, Eisenhower sets aside the intelligence reports and reaches for his personal correspondence. Tomorrow will bring new conferences, new arguments, new pressure from superiors and subordinates alike. But tonight, in the quiet of his command trailer, he must wrestle with decisions that will shape not only the final months of the war, but the post-war world that will emerge from Allied victory. The seeds of discord have been planted, and their harvest will determine whether the war ends with triumph or tragedy. Montgomery's vision, the single thrust. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Norman countryside. As Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery emerged from his command caravan, his bearing as crisp and confident as the September air. Unlike Eisenhower, who wrestled with doubt in the darkness, Montgomery possessed the unshakable certainty of a man who had never lost a major battle. He had turned the tide at El Alamein. He had commanded the ground forces through the triumphant landings at Normandy, and now he would deliver the knockout blow that would end this war before Christmas. Montgomery's strategic vision was elegantly simple in concept, devastatingly complex in execution. While Eisenhower favored the broad front approach, advancing along the entire Western Front like a great wave, Montgomery advocated for what he called the single thrust. Concentrate overwhelming force at one decisive point, punch through German defenses like a rapier through silk, and drive straight into the industrial heart of the Reich. Give me the resources, Montgomery had argued repeatedly in his clipped, precise manner, and I will finish this war in weeks, not months. His plan called for a massive concentration of Allied strength in the north. 40 divisions advancing through Belgium and Holland, crossing the Rhine at its narrowest point, then racing across the North German plain toward Berlin itself. The logic was militarily sound and historically proven. Napoleon had understood it. So had the great Prussian strategist Helmuth von Moltke. Concentration of force at the decisive point had been a fundamental principle of warfare for centuries. Why dissipate Allied strength across hundreds of miles when it could be focused like a surgical blade at Germany's most vulnerable point? Montgomery's confidence stemmed from more than mere theory. His 21st Army Group had proven itself the most consistently successful Allied formation in Western Europe. The methodical, overwhelming advances through Normandy, the lightning pursuit across the Seine, the liberation of Brussels and Antwerp, each victory had reinforced his belief that German resistance was crumbling. Intelligence reports supported this assessment. German units were retreating in disorder. Ammunition shortages were becoming critical. Fuel supplies had dwindled to a trickle. The Wehrmacht's once mighty war machine was running on fumes, held together by little more than Hitler's fanatical orders and the desperation of cornered men. "The enemy is beaten," Montgomery declared to his staff officers with characteristic certainty. "We have him on the run. Now is not the time for caution. Now is the time to pursue and destroy." His pale blue eyes held the gleam of a hunter who had cornered his prey and sensed the moment for the killing stroke had arrived. The Field Marshal's strategic concept went beyond mere military considerations. Speed was everything now, not just for tactical advantage, but for political necessity. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the east. Stalin's armies had already reached the Baltic. Soon they would be threatening the gates of Warsaw and Budapest. If the Western Allies delayed their advance, if they allowed the war to drag into 1945, they risked watching the Red Army overrun not just Germany, but potentially France and the Low Countries as well. Montgomery understood the geopolitical implications better than most. This was not simply about defeating Germany. It was about determining the shape of post-war Europe. A rapid Western advance to Berlin would ensure that democratic values, rather than communist ideology, would guide the continent's reconstruction. The race was not just against German resistance, it was against time itself. The centerpiece of Montgomery's vision was beginning to take concrete form in the detailed planning sessions that occupied his headquarters throughout early September. Operation Market Garden, a name that would soon echo through military history, represented the bold stroke that would validate everything Montgomery believed about warfare and leadership. The operation's concept was breathtaking in its audacity. 3.5 airborne divisions, over 34,000 paratroopers and glider troops, would seize a series of bridges across the major rivers of Holland. The American 101st Airborne would capture the bridges around Eindhoven. The 82nd Airborne would take the crucial crossings at Nijmegen, and the British 1st Airborne Division would secure the ultimate prize, the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. Meanwhile, the British Technical X Corps would launch a massive armoured thrust northward from the Belgian border, racing along a single highway, linking up with each airborne division in sequence, and ultimately crossing the Rhine itself within 48 hours of the operation's commencement. If successful, Market Garden would accomplish in days what conventional warfare might require months to achieve. German defences would be bypassed rather than assaulted, the Rhine barrier would be turned rather than stormed, and Allied forces would be positioned to sweep across the North German plain toward Berlin before winter weather could bog down the advance. Montgomery's staff officers worked with the focused intensity of men who sensed they were planning something historic. Maps covered every surface of the command caravan. Colored pins marked drop zones and landing sites. Radio frequencies were coordinated between units that had never operated together. Supply calculations were refined down to individual ammunition loads and fuel consumption rates. The Field Marshal himself moved through these preparations with the calm assurance of a master conductor preparing for a symphony's crescendo. He had built his reputation on meticulous planning, on leaving nothing to chance, on ensuring that when British forces advanced, they advanced with overwhelming superiority at the point of contact. Proper planning and preparation prevent poor performance, Montgomery often reminded his subordinates, and Market Garden would represent the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Every contingency would be considered, every resource would be calculated, every risk would be weighed against potential gain. Yet beneath the careful planning lay a burning ambition that Montgomery rarely allowed others to glimpse. He had spent his entire career in the shadow of more flamboyant commanders. Patton with his theatrical swagger, Rommel with his desert mystique, MacArthur with his Pacific triumphs. Market Garden would be Montgomery's masterpiece, the operation that would cement his place among history's great military leaders. The strategic situation seemed to align perfectly with Montgomery's vision. German forces in Holland were reportedly weak and demoralized, mostly second-rate units manning incomplete defensive positions. The vaunted Atlantic Wall had been designed to repel invasion from the sea, not to stop airborne assault from above. Once Allied forces crossed the Rhine, nothing stood between them and the heart of Germany except open countryside and scattered resistance. Intelligence estimates suggested that German armor in the region was minimal, perhaps a few training units and some battered formations withdrawn from France for refitting. The Luftwaffe had been virtually eliminated as an effective force. Allied air superiority was so complete that transport aircraft could operate in broad daylight without serious opposition. Montgomery's confidence was infectious among his immediate staff, but it faced skepticism from other quarters. American commanders questioned whether a single narrow thrust could maintain sufficient momentum to reach Berlin before German reserves could organize effective countermeasures. Logistics experts worried about supplying an extended advance through a single corridor that enemy forces could easily interdict. But Montgomery dismissed such concerns with the impatience of a man who had consistently proven his critics wrong. Had they not said the Normandy landings were too risky? Had they not predicted disaster when he insisted on methodical preparation rather than hasty assault? His track record spoke for itself. Careful planning combined with bold execution had delivered victory after victory. The Field Marshal's vision extended beyond the immediate tactical objectives of Market Garden. Success would validate his entire strategic philosophy, proving that concentrated force could achieve what dispersed efforts could not. It would demonstrate that British military leadership remained preeminent among the Western Allies, that Montgomery's careful professional approach was superior to American improvisation and dash. More importantly, it would end the war on terms favorable to British interests. A rapid advance to Berlin would ensure that Britain's voice would be heard in the councils that would reshape Europe. The empire that had stood alone against Hitler in 1940 would be among the first to plant its flag in the ruins of the Reich. As September progressed and Market Garden's launch date approached, Montgomery's headquarters hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Communications networks were tested and retested. Air support was coordinated down to individual squadron assignments. Medical facilities were positioned to handle expected casualties. Even prisoner of war camps were designated to handle the thousands of Germans expected to surrender once the Rhine was crossed. The field marshal himself seemed to grow more confident with each passing day. His morning briefings took on an almost celebratory tone as he outlined the operation's progress through its final planning stages. Here was the culmination of everything he had worked toward. The operation that would end the war and secure the peace. "Gentlemen," Montgomery told his assembled commanders on the eve of Market Garden's launch, "we stand on the threshold of victory. In 72 hours, we will be across the Rhine. In a week, we will be in the heart of Germany. By Christmas, we will be home." The confidence in his voice was absolute, the certainty in his bearing unshakable. He had studied every aspect of the operation, weighed every variable, calculated every risk. Market Garden would succeed because it had to succeed, because the alternative was unthinkable, because Montgomery had never failed when the stakes were highest. Outside his command caravan, the machinery of war prepared for its greatest gamble. Transport aircraft were being loaded with paratroopers and equipment. Gliders were being positioned on airfields across England. Armored divisions were moving into position along the Belgian border. Soon, the largest airborne operation in military history would be launched, and with it, Montgomery's vision of swift victory would be put to the ultimate test. The die was cast, the plans were complete, and tomorrow would bring either vindication or catastrophe. Market Garden's fall, seeds of doubt. September 17th dawned crisp and clear across England, the kind of morning that seemed to promise success. On dozens of airfields, from the Midlands to the southern counties, the greatest airborne armada ever assembled was preparing for takeoff. Nearly 1,500 transport aircraft, 478 gliders, carrying 20,000 paratroopers and glider infantry toward what Montgomery believed would be the decisive blow of the war. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, breathtaking in its audacity. 3.5 airborne divisions would seize key bridges along a narrow corridor stretching 64 miles into German-occupied Holland. The American 101st Airborne would take Eindhoven, the 82nd Airborne would secure Nijmegen, and the British 1st Airborne Division would capture the ultimate prize, the bridge at Arnhem. Meanwhile, the British 30th Corps would punch through German lines and race up this corridor, linking the airborne forces and establishing a bridgehead across the Rhine. As the first aircraft lifted off that Sunday morning, there was genuine optimism in the air. Intelligence reports suggested the German forces in Holland were demoralized, undermanned, consisting largely of second-rate troops and walking wounded. The Dutch resistance had provided detailed information about German positions, and aerial reconnaissance seemed to confirm that serious opposition would be minimal. But intelligence, as military commanders have learned throughout history, can be both blessing and curse. What the Allied planners didn't fully grasp was that two battle-hardened SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting in the very area around Arnhem. These weren't the demoralized remnants described in the reports. These were veteran formations under the command of experienced officers who had learned hard lessons on the Eastern Front. The first drops went remarkably well, almost too well. The American paratroopers of the 101st seized their objectives around Eindhoven with textbook precision. The 82nd Airborne landed successfully near Nijmegen, though they would face stiffer resistance than expected. But it was at Arnhem, the most distant and crucial objective, where the carefully laid plans began to encounter the harsh realities of warfare. The British 1st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart, faced problems from the moment they landed. The drop zones were 8 miles from the bridge, far too distant for rapid seizure of the objective. This wasn't by choice, but by necessity. The flat polders closer to Arnhem were deemed too marshy, too exposed, too dangerous for large-scale airborne operations. So the paratroopers would have to fight their way through 8 miles of increasingly hostile territory. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion, tasked with taking the bridge itself, managed to reach the northern end of the Great Span by evening on the first day. But they found themselves isolated, cut off from the rest of their division, facing growing German resistance. What they didn't know was that they had walked into a carefully orchestrated response by Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders. Model had been in Arnhem when the first paratroopers landed, initially mistaking the operation for a raid aimed at capturing him personally. But he quickly grasped the true scope of the Allied plan and began orchestrating a response that would demonstrate why he was known as the Wehrmacht's greatest defensive specialist. Within hours, he had positioned blocking forces along the routes into Arnhem, called up reserves, and begun the systematic isolation of the British paratroopers. The radio communications that were supposed to coordinate the complex operation began failing almost immediately. The sets issued to the British 1st Airborne proved inadequate for the distances involved. The terrain interfered with transmissions, and soon the various elements of the operation were fighting in virtual isolation. Urquhart himself became cut off from his headquarters, spending crucial hours hiding in an attic while his division fought without central command. Meanwhile, the ground offensive that was supposed to relieve the airborne forces was encountering its own problems. The 30th Corps, spearheaded by the Guards Armoured Division, found the single road north to be a perfect killing ground. German anti-tank guns, positioned in the flat countryside, could engage British armour at maximum range, while the narrow roadway prevented tactical manoeuvre. What was supposed to be a rapid advance became a grinding battle of attrition. By the second day, the careful synchronization that was essential to Market Garden's success was breaking down. The American paratroopers were holding their sectors, but German resistance was proving far more organized and effective than anticipated. The bridge at Nijmegen, crucial to the advance, remained in German hands despite repeated assaults. And at Arnhem, Frost's battalion was surrounded, fighting desperately to hold their end of the bridge against mounting pressure. The weather, which had been so favorable on the first day, began to deteriorate. Cloud cover over England delayed the second wave of reinforcements, disrupted supply drops, and left the isolated airborne forces increasingly short of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. The clear skies that Montgomery had counted on were replaced by the grey uncertainty of an early autumn storm front. General Urquhart, finally back in contact with his scattered forces, faced an impossible situation. His division was split into isolated pockets, unable to concentrate sufficient force to break through to the bridge. The German response had been swift and professional, sealing off the British landing zones and preventing any coordinated advance toward the objective. The radio failures meant that calling for support or redirection was nearly impossible. On the third day, the true scope of the intelligence failure became apparent. The SS Panzer divisions that weren't supposed to exist began launching coordinated counterattacks. These weren't the demoralized remnants described in Allied reports. These were veteran tank crews and panzer grenadiers who knew their business. They had studied Allied airborne tactics in Normandy, and they were applying those lessons with devastating effect. Frost's battalion, still holding the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge, was slowly being compressed into an ever smaller perimeter. German tanks, firing at point-blank range, reduced building after building to rubble. The British paratroopers, armed primarily with small arms and a few anti-tank weapons, could only watch as their positions were systematically destroyed around them. The Guards' Armoured Division, still fighting its way north along the single road, was making progress, but far too slowly. Every village became a fortress, every bridge a potential killing ground. The German defenders, fighting on familiar terrain with carefully prepared positions, extracted a heavy price for every mile of advance. The 64-mile corridor that had seemed so achievable on the planning maps was proving to be a gauntlet of unprecedented difficulty. By September 20th, 3 days into the operation, it was becoming clear that Market Garden was in serious trouble. The airborne forces were running short of everything they needed to continue fighting, while German reinforcements were arriving faster than Allied intelligence had thought possible. The weather continued to hamper resupply efforts, and the single road north remained a precarious lifeline under constant attack. Montgomery, monitoring the operation from his tactical headquarters, faced the most difficult decision of his career. The reports from Arnhem were increasingly desperate. Frost's battalion was nearly out of ammunition, and the 30th Corps was still miles away from the bridge. The bold stroke that was supposed to end the war by Christmas was turning into a costly failure, and with it, his entire strategic philosophy was being called into question. The final blow came on September 21st, when Frost's battalion, after 4 days of heroic resistance, was finally overwhelmed. The bridge at Arnhem, the key to the entire operation, remained firmly in German hands. The surviving paratroopers were taken prisoner, and with them went any hope of establishing a bridgehead across the Rhine. The evacuation of the remaining British forces south of the river began that night, a desperate operation conducted under cover of darkness and driving rain. Of the 10,000 men of the 1st Airborne Division who had landed so confidently 4 days earlier, only 2,400 would make it back across the lower Rhine. The rest were dead, wounded, or prisoners. Market Garden's failure sent shockwaves through the Allied High Command. The operation that was supposed to vindicate Montgomery's single-thrust strategy had instead demonstrated its fundamental weaknesses. The narrow corridor approach, the reliance on perfect coordination, the assumption that German resistance would collapse, all had proven fatally flawed when confronted with military reality. For Montgomery personally, the failure was devastating. His reputation for careful planning and methodical success was severely damaged. The bold gamble that was supposed to establish him as the war's most innovative commander had instead raised serious questions about his judgment, his understanding of German capabilities, and his ability to adapt when operations didn't proceed according to plan. The strategic implications were even more profound. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, which Montgomery had criticized so vehemently, now appeared vindicated. The war would not end in 1944, the Rhine would not be crossed until the following spring, and the path to victory would be the grinding, methodical advance that the supreme Allied commander had always favored. As autumn settled over the flooded polders of Holland, the seeds of doubt about concentrated offensives had been firmly planted. The greatest airborne operation in history had ended in failure, and with it, the dream of swift victory through bold strategic strokes. Eisenhower's perspective, the broad front. In the aftermath of Market Garden's failure, Dwight David Eisenhower found himself vindicated, yet strangely unsatisfied. The supreme Allied commander had never taken pleasure in being proven right when the cost was measured in thousands of casualties, scattered across the bridges and polders of Holland. As October rains began to fall across the Western Front, washing the last remnants of autumn's optimism from the battlefield, Eisenhower retreated to his quiet study at SHAEF headquarters to contemplate the path forward. The maps spread before him told a story of opportunity and constraint, of promise and limitation, from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The Allied line stretched like a taut bowstring, pressing against German defenses that had hardened with each passing day, unlike Montgomery, whose gaze invariably fixed upon the narrow corridor leading to Berlin. Eisenhower saw the entire chessboard, every piece, every potential combination. The broad front strategy had been born not from timidity, but from profound understanding of modern warfare's realities. Where Montgomery saw concentration of force as the key to breakthrough, Eisenhower recognized that dispersal of pressure could be equally decisive. The German army, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, could not reinforce everywhere simultaneously. By maintaining pressure along the entire Western Front, the Allies forced their enemy into an impossible calculus, defending everything, protecting nothing adequately. This was not the romantic vision of warfare that appealed to newspaper correspondents, or even to some of his subordinate commanders. There would be no dramatic breakthrough, no lightning thrust to capture headlines and imagination. Instead, Eisenhower envisioned a methodical, inexorable advance, like rising tide that overwhelmed every defensive position through sheer persistence and superior resources. The logistical mathematics supported his reasoning with cold precision. The Allied supply chain, stretching back through the Norman ports and across the Channel, could sustain broad pressure more effectively than concentrated assault. Each division required tons of ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies daily. Concentrating forces meant concentrating supply requirements, creating vulnerable bottlenecks that German counterattacks could exploit. The failure at Arnhem had demonstrated this principle with tragic clarity, as airborne divisions found themselves isolated, beyond the reach of adequate resupply. Eisenhower's broad front offered redundancy, flexibility, the ability to shift emphasis as opportunities developed. If Patton's Third Army encountered weakness in the Saar, reinforcements could flow southward. If the British Second Army found gaps near the Rhine, resources could move north. The strategy preserved options, maintained initiative, kept the German High Command guessing about Allied intentions. But perhaps more importantly, the broad front reflected Eisenhower's deepest understanding of coalition warfare's delicate politics. The Supreme Allied Commander commanded not a unified army, but a complex alliance of nations, each with distinct military traditions, political objectives, and national pride. American generals like Patton and Bradley chafed at the prospect of playing supporting roles to British-led offensives. French commanders demanded meaningful participation in their homeland's liberation. Even within national contingents, rivalry and ambition created friction that careful diplomacy had to manage. Where Montgomery's approach demanded subordination, Eisenhower's strategy offered participation. Every army group, every national contingent could contribute meaningfully to victory. The psychological impact of this inclusive approach extended far beyond military effectiveness. Touching the very foundations of Allied unity, soldiers fought more effectively when they believed their sacrifice mattered, when they saw their nation's flag advancing alongside their allies. The contrast between the two commanders' leadership styles had become increasingly apparent as autumn deepened into winter. Montgomery commanded through assertion, demanding compliance with his vision through force of personality and tactical brilliance. His briefings were performances, delivered with theatrical confidence that brooked no contradiction. Subordinates received orders, not invitations to discuss alternatives. Eisenhower's approach reflected different principles entirely. The Supreme Allied Commander understood that coalition leadership required consensus building, that lasting decisions emerged from discussion rather than decree. His staff meetings resembled seminars more than military briefings, with senior commanders encouraged to voice concerns, suggest modifications, contribute expertise. This collaborative style frustrated some officers who preferred clear directives to nuanced guidance, but it produced strategies that every participant felt invested in executing. The diplomatic challenges facing Eisenhower extended far beyond military planning. Churchill continued pressing for Mediterranean operations that would enhance British influence in post-war Europe. Stalin demanded Western offensives that would relieve pressure on Soviet forces. Roosevelt insisted that American casualties be justified by meaningful strategic gains. De Gaulle fought for French participation in every major operation. Each ally brought legitimate concerns, historical grievances, future ambitions that military planning had to accommodate. Montgomery's single-thrust strategy, for all its tactical elegance, ignored these political realities. A British-led drive to Berlin would have relegated American forces to secondary roles, frustrated French aspirations for national redemption, and created post-war complications that victory itself might not resolve. The broad front offered something more valuable than swift conquest. It promised shared victory, mutual respect, foundation for lasting peace. As winter approached, Eisenhower's strategy began demonstrating its fundamental soundness. German reserves, scattered across the entire front, could not concentrate against any single threat. Allied pressure, applied consistently from multiple directions, gradually wore down enemy resistance through attrition rather than breakthrough. Supply lines, distributed across numerous routes, proved resilient against interdiction. Most importantly, Allied unity remained intact, weathering the disappointments of autumn without fracturing into national recriminations. The Supreme Allied Commander found particular satisfaction in watching his subordinate commanders adapt to the broad front's requirements. Patton, initially frustrated by perceived constraints on his armored spearheads, discovered that methodical advance could be as rewarding as dramatic breakthrough. Bradley, comfortable with systematic approaches, excelled at coordinating multiple corps' advances. Even Montgomery, grudgingly accepting his role within the larger strategy, began demonstrating the tactical skill that had made him famous in North Africa. This evolution reflected Eisenhower's greatest strength as coalition commander, his ability to extract maximum performance from diverse personalities while maintaining strategic coherence. Unlike commanders who imposed uniform approaches, Eisenhower adapted his strategy to leverage each subordinate's particular talents. Patton received missions that utilized his aggressive instincts. Montgomery got assignments that rewarded methodical preparation. Bradley coordinated operations that demanded careful staff work. The broad front strategy also reflected hard lessons learned from earlier campaigns. The breakout from Normandy had succeeded precisely because German reserves, concentrated against expected breakthrough points, could not respond effectively to multiple simultaneous advances. The liberation of France had proceeded smoothly when Allied forces advanced along multiple axes, preventing German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines. Market Garden's failure had demonstrated the risks of concentration, the vulnerability of single thrusts to unexpected resistance. These experiences shaped Eisenhower's conviction that modern warfare favored distributed pressure over concentrated assault. Improved communications allowed coordinated operations across extended fronts. Mechanized transportation enabled rapid reinforcement of successful advances. Air superiority provided intelligence and interdiction capabilities that supported simultaneous operations. The broad front strategy leveraged these technological advantages while minimizing traditional risks associated with dispersed forces. Critics of Eisenhower's approach, both contemporary and historical, often focused on opportunities allegedly missed through excessive caution. They argued that concentrated assault might have achieved breakthrough, that bold leadership could have ended the war months earlier, that political considerations should not have constrained military effectiveness. These criticisms reflected fundamental misunderstanding of coalition warfare's complexities. The constraints facing any supreme Allied commander responsible for maintaining alliance unity while achieving military victory. The autumn of 1944 had tested that unity severely. Market Garden's failure could have shattered confidence in Allied leadership, triggered recriminations between national contingents, undermined the coalition's effectiveness. Instead, Eisenhower's diplomatic skill had preserved cooperation, channeled disappointment into renewed determination, maintained focus on ultimate objectives rather than immediate setbacks. As November rain turned to December snow, the wisdom of the broad front strategy became increasingly apparent. German resistance, while still formidable, showed signs of systematic weakening. Supply shortages, manpower constraints, deteriorating morale affected enemy units across the entire Western Front. No single Allied breakthrough might have achieved what sustained pressure was accomplishing: the gradual erosion of German capacity for organized resistance. The Supreme Allied Commander understood that victory, when it came, would validate not dramatic gestures, but patient strategy. Not individual brilliance, but collective effort. Not national glory, but Allied cooperation. The broad front represented more than military doctrine. It embodied the democratic principles for which the alliance fought, the belief that diverse peoples could unite against tyranny. That patient determination would ultimately triumph over aggressive ambition. In his quiet moments, reviewing intelligence reports and casualty figures, Eisenhower sometimes wondered whether history would remember the broad front strategy kindly. Military historians traditionally celebrated dramatic campaigns, brilliant maneuvers, individual commanders who achieved swift victory through tactical innovation. The methodical advance he envisioned offered fewer opportunities for romantic narrative, less scope for personal glorification. But the Supreme Allied Commander had never sought personal glory, only Allied victory achieved through means that would preserve the coalition's unity and democratic values. The broad front strategy, for all its apparent caution, represented the boldest possible approach to coalition warfare, trusting in collective strength rather than individual brilliance, in democratic cooperation rather than authoritarian efficiency. As winter settled over Europe, Eisenhower's strategy prepared for its ultimate test, confident that patient pressure would achieve what dramatic gestures had failed to accomplish, that the alliance would emerge victorious, united, and worthy of the peace it sought to build. The Ardennes offensive, a front under pressure. Yet even as Eisenhower's methodical approach demonstrated its diplomatic wisdom, Even as the broad front strategy maintained unity among fractious allies, the true test of this patient philosophy lay ahead. For in the forests of the Ardennes, in those same rolling hills where German armies had broken through in 1940, Adolf Hitler was preparing one final gamble that would challenge every assumption about coalition warfare. The Führer's reasoning possessed a terrible logic. Germany's position in December 1944 was desperate but not yet hopeless. The Western Allies had paused to consolidate their gains. Their supply lines stretched thin across France. Their armies spread along Eisenhower's broad front from the North Sea to Switzerland. If a concentrated German assault could split this extended line, if it could drive a wedge between American and British forces, perhaps the alliance would fracture under pressure. Hitler's plan was audacious in its scope. 3 German armies would strike through the Ardennes forest, the same route that had brought such spectacular success 4 years earlier. The objective was Antwerp, that crucial port through which Allied supplies flowed. Capture Antwerp, and the British 21st Army Group would be cut off, isolated, potentially destroyed. Such a victory might force the Western Allies to negotiate, allowing Germany to concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviets in the east. The operation would be called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive codename designed to conceal its true nature. 24 divisions would participate, including elite Waffen-SS panzer units pulled from the Eastern Front. The assault would begin in darkness, supported by the largest concentration of German artillery assembled since 1943, striking at the weakest point in Allied lines. For the Ardennes sector was indeed weak. Eisenhower had positioned only 4 American divisions along this 80-mile front, treating it as a quiet sector where green troops could gain experience and veteran units could rest after heavy fighting. The 106th Infantry Division had only recently arrived from the United States, while the 4th Infantry Division was recovering from the brutal campaign in the Hürtgen Forest. Between them, the 28th Infantry Division held a front so extended that effective defense seemed impossible. This deployment reflected the fundamental assumptions of Eisenhower's broad front strategy. By maintaining pressure everywhere, the Supreme Commander believed he could prevent German concentrations, force the enemy to defend all sectors equally. Yet this same logic meant Allied forces were spread thin, vulnerable to precisely the kind of concentrated assault Hitler was planning. German preparations proceeded with remarkable secrecy. Radio silence was maintained. Troop movements occurred only at night. Even senior commanders received their briefings mere days before the attack. Allied intelligence, still recovering from the overconfidence that had characterized assessments before Market Garden, detected unusual activity but failed to grasp its significance. The weather favored German deception, low clouds and fog grounding Allied reconnaissance aircraft that might have revealed the massive buildup. On December 16th, at 5:30 in the morning, the German offensive began. 800 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, their shells crashing down on American positions along the entire Ardennes front. The sound could be heard 50 miles away, a rolling thunder that announced Hitler's final gamble had commenced. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise. Entire American units were overrun before they could organize effective resistance. The 106th Infantry Division, caught in exposed positions near the German border, found itself surrounded within hours. 2 complete regiments, nearly 9,000 men, would eventually be forced to surrender in what became the largest American capitulation in the European theater. German panzer spearheads penetrated deep into Allied lines. Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by the ruthless SS Oberführer Joachim Peiper, advanced 25 miles in the first day, leaving a trail of destruction and atrocity in its wake. At Malmedy, German troops murdered 84 American prisoners, a war crime that would stiffen Allied resistance but demonstrated the desperate savagery driving this final offensive. The speed of the German advance created chaos in Allied command structures. Communications broke down as headquarters were overrun or forced to evacuate. Units lost contact with their commanders. Isolated groups of Americans found themselves fighting desperate holding actions against overwhelming odds. The carefully orchestrated machinery of Eisenhower's broad front strategy seemed to be disintegrating under the hammer blows of concentrated German assault. Yet it was precisely in this moment of crisis that the true strength of Allied coalition warfare began to manifest. Unlike the rigid hierarchies that characterized German military culture, the Allied command structure possessed remarkable flexibility. When formal communications failed, individual commanders took initiative, adapting to rapidly changing circumstances without waiting for orders from above. At the critical road junction of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, rushed from reserve positions, established a defensive perimeter that would become legendary. These paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Market Garden, understood that holding this transportation hub was essential to disrupting German logistics. When surrounded and offered terms of surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe delivered his famous one-word reply, "Nuts," a response that perfectly captured the stubborn resilience of American forces. The defense of Bastogne illustrated how Eisenhower's emphasis on coalition cooperation had created unexpected reserves of strength. British forces immediately moved to support their American allies, while French resistance fighters provided crucial intelligence about German movements. Even as the immediate tactical situation appeared desperate, the broader strategic framework held firm. Eisenhower's response to the crisis demonstrated the maturation of his command philosophy. Rather than attempting to micromanage the battle from Supreme Headquarters, he focused on mobilizing resources and maintaining Allied unity. Within hours of the German attack, he had transferred operational control of American forces north of the breakthrough to Montgomery, a decision that caused considerable controversy but ensured unified command where it mattered most. This willingness to subordinate national pride to military necessity exemplified the coalition warfare principles Eisenhower had championed throughout the campaign. Montgomery, whatever his faults, possessed extensive experience in defensive operations, while his British forces could be rapidly repositioned to contain the northern shoulder of the German penetration. The decision was pragmatic, effective, and ultimately vindicated by results. The weather, which had initially favored German operations, gradually shifted to Allied advantage. As skies cleared after Christmas, Allied air power returned to the battlefield with devastating effect. Thousands of sorties pounded German supply columns, already struggling with fuel shortages that plagued the offensive from its inception. The Luftwaffe, making its final major appearance of the war, was overwhelmed by Allied numerical superiority and superior pilot training. German logistics, always the Achilles heel of ambitious operations, began to collapse under sustained pressure. Panzer units, designed for rapid breakthrough operations, found themselves engaged in prolonged urban combat for which they were poorly suited. The very success of initial penetrations created extended supply lines vulnerable to Allied interdiction, while fuel shortages immobilized entire armored formations. By early January, the German offensive had clearly failed. The farthest advance, achieved by the 2nd Panzer Division near Dinant, fell just 4 miles short of the Meuse River, far from the ambitious objectives Hitler had envisioned. Bastogne remained in Allied hands, its defenders relieved by Patton's Third Army in a remarkable display of rapid redeployment. The German salient, stretched thin and vulnerable, became a target for Allied counterattacks. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, validated Eisenhower's broad front strategy in ways its architect had never anticipated. The very dispersal of forces that had seemed to invite German attack ultimately contained that assault within manageable limits. No single breakthrough could achieve decisive results against an enemy deployed across such an extended front, while Allied reserves could be rapidly concentrated from multiple directions. More significantly, the battle demonstrated the resilience of democratic military institutions under extreme pressure. Unlike authoritarian systems that depended on rigid hierarchy, Allied forces had developed the flexibility and initiative necessary to adapt when formal command structures broke down. Individual units, cut off from higher headquarters, continued fighting effectively, trusting in the broader strategic framework even when immediate circumstances appeared hopeless. The human cost was severe, with American casualties exceeding 80,000. But the strategic implications were profound. Germany had committed its last significant reserves to this offensive, sacrificing experienced units that could never be replaced. The Ardennes operation, intended to split the Western Alliance, instead accelerated German collapse by consuming resources desperately needed for defense of the Reich itself. As January snow began to fall across the battered landscape of the Ardennes, Allied forces methodically eliminated the German salient. The same methodical pressure that had characterized Eisenhower's campaign since Normandy now compressed the overextended German positions, forcing withdrawal to defensive lines that grew weaker with each passing day. The strategic debate that had raged since August was finally settled, not by theoretical argument, but by the harsh test of combat. Montgomery's concentrated thrust had failed at Arnhem, while Eisenhower's broad front had absorbed and defeated Germany's most desperate gamble. The patient accumulation of pressure, the careful maintenance of Allied unity, the trust in collective strength over individual brilliance, all had proven their worth in the crucible of winter warfare. And the final push and legacy. The strategic debate that had raged since August was finally settled, not by theoretical argument, but by the harsh test of combat. Montgomery's concentrated thrust had failed at Arnhem, while Eisenhower's broad front had absorbed and defeated Germany's most desperate gamble. The patient accumulation of pressure, the careful maintenance of Allied unity, the trust in collective strength over individual brilliance, all had proven their worth in the crucible of winter warfare. As February turned to March in 1945, the fruits of Eisenhower's methodical approach began to ripen along the entire Western Front. The broad front strategy, once criticized as overly cautious, now revealed its true genius. While Montgomery had dreamed of a single decisive blow, Eisenhower had built something far more formidable. A vast machine of coordinated pressure that stretched German defenses beyond their breaking point. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, Allied armies pressed forward with relentless, synchronized momentum. The crossing of the Rhine, that ancient barrier that had protected Germanic peoples for millennia, came not as a single dramatic stroke, but as a series of carefully orchestrated operations. Each crossing reinforced the others. Each bridgehead threatened German reserves that were already stretched impossibly thin. This was the broad front strategy in its purest form. Multiple simultaneous threats that made coherent German defense impossible. Bradley's forces crossed at Remagen when a bridge fell intact into American hands. A stroke of fortune that Eisenhower's flexible command structure could exploit immediately. Patton's Third Army forced the river further south, while Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared their own elaborate crossing in the north. The very multiplicity of these operations, the sheer breadth of Allied pressure, meant that German commanders could never concentrate their dwindling reserves effectively. In these final weeks of the European war, as Allied columns raced across the German countryside, the wisdom of Eisenhower's coalition approach became undeniable. The supreme Allied commander had built something unprecedented in military history. A truly integrated multinational force that functioned as a single organism. American industrial might, British tactical expertise, French determination to reclaim their homeland, Canadian steadfastness, Polish courage, all welded together into an instrument of overwhelming power. The human cost of this achievement, the price paid in blood and sacrifice, weighed heavily on Eisenhower's mind as victory approached. Every strategic decision, every choice between Montgomery's bold strokes and methodical advance, had carried the weight of countless lives. The broad front strategy had perhaps prolonged the war, but it had also ensured that when victory came, it would be complete and lasting. Montgomery's vision of ending the war quickly through concentrated action had possessed undeniable appeal, the promise of saving lives through decisive action. But Eisenhower had understood something deeper about the nature of this conflict, that lasting victory required not just military success, but political stability. Not just the defeat of German armies, but the creation of conditions for enduring peace. As German resistance crumbled in April 1945, as Allied forces encountered the full horror of the concentration camps, the moral dimension of their struggle became starkly clear. This had been no ordinary war, no simple contest between rival powers, but a fundamental struggle between civilization and barbarism. The methodical coalition-based approach that Eisenhower had championed, the patient building of unity among diverse allies, had created not just military victory, but moral authority. The final collapse came with stunning rapidity. German armies that had fought with desperate ferocity through the winter months suddenly disintegrating as their supply lines snapped and their command structure fractured. The broad front strategy, which had seemed so ponderous compared to Montgomery's lightning strokes, now revealed its inexorable power. There was nowhere for German forces to retreat, no possibility of forming new defensive lines, when pressure came simultaneously from every direction. Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker, the unconditional surrender signed at Reims, these dramatic moments marked the end of the European war. But the true victory had been won through months of patient, coordinated pressure. Eisenhower's vision of coalition warfare had triumphed not through brilliant individual strokes, but through the accumulated weight of unified effort. In the quiet aftermath of victory, as the guns fell silent across Europe, the lessons of the strategic debate between Eisenhower and Montgomery began to crystallize. Both men had brought essential qualities to the Allied cause: Montgomery's tactical brilliance and unwavering confidence, Eisenhower's diplomatic skill and strategic patience. But the nature of modern warfare, the complexity of coalition politics, the sheer scale of global conflict, had demanded something beyond individual genius. The broad front strategy had succeeded because it recognized fundamental truths about leadership in democratic societies. Victory could not be imposed through the will of a single commander, however brilliant, but had to emerge from the collective strength of allied peoples. The patient work of building consensus, of maintaining unity among diverse partners, of balancing competing national interests. These unglamorous tasks had proven more valuable than tactical brilliance. Montgomery's concentrated thrusts had failed not because they lacked audacity or skill, but because they underestimated the political dimensions of coalition warfare. Every military operation existed within a web of diplomatic relationships, national sensitivities, competing objectives that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Eisenhower's genius lay in understanding these complexities, in building strategies that strengthened rather than strained the bonds of alliance. The human cost of the European war, the millions of lives lost in the struggle against fascism, gave weight and meaning to these strategic lessons. Each decision had carried consequences that rippled through countless families, countless communities, countless futures that would never be realized. The responsibility of command in such circumstances required not just military skill, but profound moral seriousness, the recognition that strategy must serve larger purposes than tactical success. Eisenhower had carried this burden with quiet dignity throughout the war, understanding that his role extended far beyond the coordination of military operations. He had been building the foundation for post-war cooperation, demonstrating that democratic nations could work together effectively, creating precedents for the international institutions that would shape the coming peace. The strategic debate that had consumed so much energy in the autumn of 1944, the tension between concentrated thrust and broad front, had ultimately been resolved in favor of patience over audacity, coalition over individual brilliance, methodical progress over dramatic gesture. These were not merely military preferences, but reflections of deeper democratic values. The belief that lasting achievement required collective effort rather than individual genius. As the years passed and historians examined the record of the European campaign, the wisdom of Eisenhower's approach became increasingly clear. The broad front strategy had not only won the war, but had done so in a way that strengthened the alliance for the challenges ahead. The relationships forged in the crucible of combat, the habits of cooperation developed through months of coordinated operations, the trust built through shared sacrifice, all would prove invaluable in the decades to come. Montgomery's vision of quick victory through concentrated action would always retain its appeal, the promise of decisive results through bold leadership. But Eisenhower's patient coalition building, his willingness to accept slower progress in exchange for stronger unity, had created something more enduring than tactical success. He had demonstrated that democratic societies, for all their apparent inefficiencies and internal debates, possessed a strength that authoritarian regimes could never match. The strategic principles that emerged from this great test would echo through subsequent conflicts. The recognition that military success must serve political objectives, that coalition warfare requires different skills than national command, that patience and persistence often achieve more than brilliant improvisation. These lessons, written in the blood and sacrifice of the European campaign, would guide democratic leaders through the challenges of the Cold War and beyond. In the gathering dusk of memory, as the details of tactical debates fade into the broader sweep of history, what remains is the image of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things through collective effort. The broad front strategy was ultimately a reflection of democratic faith, the belief that free peoples working together could overcome any tyranny, that patient cooperation could triumph over brilliant despotism, that the accumulated strength of diverse allies could prove more powerful than the concentrated might of any single force. Eisenhower and Montgomery, their strategic disagreements now softened by the passage of time, had both served this larger cause with distinction and honor. Their debate over concentrated thrust versus broad front had been conducted within the framework of shared values, common objectives, mutual respect for the democratic principles they defended. The tension between their approaches had strengthened rather than weakened the Allied cause, forcing deeper consideration of strategic options, ensuring that final victory would be both complete and lasting. The echoes of their great strategic debate continue to resonate, in the quiet halls where modern leaders wrestle with complex decisions, in the patient work of building international cooperation, in the enduring recognition that the greatest victories are won not through individual brilliance, but through the accumulated strength of united peoples working toward common goals, their diverse talents and perspectives woven together into something stronger and more enduring than any single vision, however bold or brilliant, could ever achieve alone.